What's your family story worth to you? And I'm not talking about the shiny ones that everybody knows about. I mean the buried ones, the secrets, the heartbreaks, the ones that only slipped out after a night of too much Hennessy. That's what Vietnam Story Bank is for. No polish, no rewrites, no editing, just raw, recorded, beautiful beating history. The kind that makes you sit up and hold your breath. Your father's memories of his mother's wildest dreams, your grandparents' laughter that echoes in your bones. We dig it all up, we record it, and hand it back to you, safe, untouchable, and unforgettable. Because when your stories disappear, they're gone forever. So go to VietnamStoryBank.com today and make sure your family's stories are recorded. I have Andrew Lam back on the podcast with me. Thank you so much for coming and speaking with me today.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
This idea of what April 30 means to us, I think you and I share a lot of this sort of living in so many different worlds with this idea of April 30. I think on the one hand, we have deep and strong connections and ties to Vietnam, present day Vietnam. And you and I both have similar backgrounds with our fathers in the South Vietnamese army. And I know that not everybody around the world, not every Vietnamese person shares the confusion. Some are black and white. Some are
Right.
Some just don't care. It's not even black and white. It's just like a void of any meaning as they live their lives. I want to start by asking, what does April 30 mean to you?
Yeah. So it sounds like an easy answer, but it isn't, because it's been 50 years and my feelings about that date changes with time. 1975, April 30th, I was 11 years old and I was in a refugee camp called Guam because we have been deposited it there a day before. Um, and I was lost. Everyone was walking around like zombies because we had no idea what's going to happen to us. America wasn't willing to accept refugees at that point. And then on top of it, the news on the radio announced the fall of Saigon. And so that particular date, since I'm old enough to remember it very clearly, was terrifying because, you feel this hole in your stomach on that particular date, if I recall it, because you're in no man's land. You're completely displaced. You have no home to go back to, and you have no destination unless America opened its doors. And so the weeping in that Guam camp was a collective weeping. We left people behind. My father was still back there. We didn't know what happened to him, relatives and friends who may have been stuck. And we know what could happen to those left behind because we've seen the results of 1968 in Tet Offensive in Hue, where they buried thousands of people alive. And so the fear was that the revenge will be swift and bloody. And so you live with that uncertainty, So that was the actual date of 1975, before it becomes Ngày Quốc Hận, I actually experienced the moment of a lost country, right? And it broke my heart, although I wouldn't know it. I don't think I knew that until much later on, but I was completely shattered. 1976, I remember because by then we moved to San Francisco and there were a handful of Vietnamese living there and in the area. And we were protesting. I was wearing a white headband like everyone else, like để tang, like we're mourning, but not for a relative so much as mourning the loss of country. And so we stood there and we say, đã đảo Cộng sản, give Vietnam back to us and that sort of thing, we stood outside of City Hall. I'm not sure what City Hall can do, but that's what we did. And, there was a gathering where people were singing songs, and the same thing the next year, and there were songs like Mẹ Việt Nam ơi, chúng con vẫn còn đây, so I can only speak from that memory, but that there was a moment where my feelings were not completely off with those of the collective, which is that we were mourning, we were in shock, we still want our homeland back, knowing that we cannot have it, and so we live with this brevity, of loss. But then my life changed. I became American. I integrated in American life probably much faster than anyone else in my family because I was the youngest. I changed my name. And then over time, the date become less heavy, even though it still carry all that burden of memories. Um, and within my family, my father carried the wound deeply because his guilt is very hard to talk about because it's so profound. He left, but he felt as if he had abandoned his comrades in arms. Not that he could do anything if he had stayed, except for going to jail with them. But the fact that he left and they stay left him wounded, in psychically. And though he remade himself in America, his night talks was always about Vietnam, about the battles they fought, the people who died, and the people who lived and the wounds that he saw and so on. So I lived with that war. I don't think it has to do with April 30th so much as every night that war came back in some form or another. So I think in some ways profound. I wrote about it in Perfume Dreams. That's why I wrote it. It's because this Americanized kid trying to make it in America as like a newly made person, but he carried a heavy burden of that war. And how does anyone who carry that memories, become an American while the sadness and the grief and the tragedy of our lives are not really expressed in American narratives. We're just like side actors or background actors, in that story. And so I think that's why I started writing, really. But in Perfume Dreams, my first book, I talk about the first time I came back, and then I was confronted with that date. Because I came back as a journalist for a news service, writing for a wire service that was on AP. And so I was assigned, after covering Hong Kong, Cambodia, suddenly my boss said, go back to your home country and write about the thaw of the Cold War. This is 1991. And I had to fly into Vietnam and, naively at 20 something, 26, 27, I gave the guy my passport. And he said, when did you leave Vietnam? And I say, 2 days, 2 ngày trước khi mất nước, 2 days before National Lost Day. And he was a young man, and he has this look on his face in Hanoi of all places. He's like, ôi trời ơi, mất nước hồi nào anh? When did we lose the country? And I thought about it like, you didn't lose the country. I did,
Yeah.
And so then and he said, anh muốn nói là, and I said 28 thì, 28 thì tháng 4 1975, 28th of April, because that's when I left. And he said, do you mean ngày giải phóng, National Liberation Day? And I thought, wow, and I started kind of, I kind of started giggling because I thought the irony was so thick, and because I was like, wow, the returning Vietnamese American and the Vietnamese who speak the same language at this moment, but not really the same language, you know what I mean? Because by then we had carried two different streams of history, His is like this propaganda version of like, oh, giải phóng miền Nam or something, right? And mine was like, oh my God, we lost that country. That date was the date we lost our country. And I say to him that I say, you're probably right. It's probably a liberation day. But in my mind, I wasn't thinking liberation for Vietnamese. I was thinking that liberation in the sense that I've grown, I've changed, I become cosmopolitan by then. I was become more worldly, and that day doesn't own me the way it used to, and that I've self-liberated from the hatred. You know, I have gone into Vietnam with a kind of objective mind just to see what's happening there without passing too much personal bias and judgment. So I feel like, yeah, I'm kind of liberating myself going back because I want to confront that past. I want to write about it in a way that makes sense and balance, which is what I'm taught to do as a journalist. So I thought the self-liberating day is also an important thing, for me on that day.
As a journalist, as a writer, a thinker, somebody who ponders a lot about the experience of the Vietnamese diaspora,
Yeah.
I look to you and your writing, and it's so cynical sometimes, and it's so light, but it's so deep, and it's so uh, antagonistic in all directions. And I find a lot of joy in the freedom that you have attained, and you just said it. And I am trying to find the compassion, to have compassion and sympathy for everybody, but it is
Mhm.
so damn confusing sometimes because
Yeah.
on one end, I want to respect and I want to love and I want to sympathize with the loss. And I want to understand the people that came when they were 12, 13, 11 years old to America and they had fathers locked up in camps.
Yeah.
And I didn't go through that. I was born in the United States.
Yeah.
And I've had a few dinner party explosions, and with a little alcohol, and
Yeah.
things have not gone well. And I feel like I'm atoning for those sins now,
Mm.
because of my lack of kindness
Mm.
to the previous generation, your generation, my parents' generation. And we've talked about forgiveness and finding that forgiveness. But the hard question is, do you think the other side forgives us?
Yeah, well, it's complicated because forgiveness is not something that is done collectively. I think it has to be done on the individual basis. You don't really come to forgiving until you go through some spiritual phase of your life, and that's not something that you can force upon the people. Um, I think individually there are still bitterness on all sides. I mean, how can you not, right? But I think if they don't forgive, the reality is it's been 50 years and they forget. Meaning that, for instance, in Vietnam, the population more than tripled since I left that country in 1975. The average age is probably 35, which is born 15 years after the war. And so if you talk about forgive or forget, it's more like forget, collectively speaking, because I have gone back to Vietnam since 25 years ago with every time it's a 25th or 30th anniversary, I'm doing something in Vietnam back then. And I had gone in once with an American journalist, and basically she just asked me to translate for her when we talked to a group of young people, and her first question was, "What do you think of that war?" Right? And a young man just sort of looked at her and say, "Which war? Because if you didn't go through war, Vietnam War or French War or war in Japanese occupation, a war with China or a war in Cambodia, all of that is historical pages. It's not something that is of raw memory." So we in America only look at that war as a singular war, but in Vietnam they had gone through uh, 5, 6 wars in the last under 20, 30 years. And so for Vietnamese now, it's just another page in the history book, you know. And I think that's something we have to think about too, is that um, for those who carry the memory, it's very hard to work through it, but for those who were born after, it's almost like very hard to understand, which is which is the curse of being human, is that you tend to repeat what you don't understand.
Both of our fathers and many of our friends' fathers were in seat of power and positions,
Yeah.
control, great lives before 1975, April 30. And arguably, we are the children of privilege, massive privilege. And we've enjoyed the last 50 years here in America
Yeah.
and abroad. And we've built lives, and we have arguably have had better lives if we were to stay in Vietnam.
Yeah.
Life has turned out too bad for us. So I think for me, just sort of playing with all of the sort of these factors,
Yeah.
um, and understanding like forgiveness and moving on. And it's like, wow, we not only did we have the really fat end of the stick before the war, we had the pleasures, we had the lifestyle. I didn't. I was born in the United States shortly after the war. So, but everybody, on our quote unquote on our side, lived through great times in the 60s and 70s. Albeit the war and a lot of losses. But then when we got to America, we had nothing in our pockets, but the opportunity to rebuild these lives has allowed us to really prosper.
Yeah.
What
I think the fact that so many have done well, especially that first wave that I know, because they, in many ways, the first wave were privileged in many different ways. Besides, for me, I didn't even take a boat, right? I just flew over. But that I went from 6th grade to 7th grade without any, interruption in the middle. Whereas like some people had to, wait in refugee camp for years for that sort of thing. So then, you know, their integration into America was very fast and successful for many, and I think in some way, when we talk about forgiveness, I think the fact that we have ascended from our initial refugee status of having nothing and wearing donated clothes that first year to, going to Berkeley and Stanford, that sort of thing, is that it does dampen the blows. It dampened the pains and of loss and so on. Even though some people would swear of never returning to Vietnam, but the very least the what America have afforded us is this idea that, well, we found another country, we have taken roots elsewhere, and we become a different kind of people, and that really heals some of the old wounds.
Mostly all the episodes that I do are mostly very personal, but this
Yeah.
one is really damn personal. This episode, because we're landing on the day of 4:30, and
Yeah.
I think that in my life I've pissed a lot of people off with this privilege, this entitlement of
Yeah.
not knowing what my older brothers that are like 14, 15 years older than I, they had to live through the camp, their fathers going to camp, and being very
Yeah.
insensitive to the experience of the previous
Yeah.
generation. And I feel guilty because I've gotten into a lot of heated battles with this, and I feel very sorry for the way I've carried myself. I think in the past, and in the past year, but there's this anger that boils inside of me when I think of like the Vietnamese people all over the world as family. We are all family, and I can't. Sometimes I can't approach the nuances the way I should, and it's a huge block for me. And I wanted to ask you, um, as somebody who I think is fairly fluid in the way you think about polarity and the way you think about different sides, and just yeah, I read your writing and I'm so entertained by the way you write about sexual orientation and experience in all sorts of polarizing situations that you can make fun and make light of these things. What gives you that? Because I want to learn that, and I want to apply it to the way I think.
Wow, that's complicated. Um, I I I deal with very sad and tragic things in my life, but I think I bring my personality to bear. And if anyone who knows me is that I am, for the most part, very joyful. Um, I find there is humor in all things, even the saddest. And so I come from a point of view of not passing judgment so much as observing the follies of being human, which is kind of like a Buddhist way of approaching things, you know. But I don't claim to dismiss people. I hear them, I acknowledge them. I just know that I'm not in that emotional life that they have. Uh, that's why, when I was growing up, I was overwhelmed by the sadness of my parents, for instance. And I had to figure a way out of that morass because there is a way in which that tragedy can be inherited without knowing, right? And in some way, because they cannot solve their sadness and they cannot solve their grief, they live with the anger. But what they don't understand is that they impose it on the second generation, well, without knowing, you know. Or in
And
my
that's
dad's
the
case,
rebellion that I'm feeling. That
yeah,
exactly is the rebelliousness that I'm feeling.
yeah, you feel like if you love them, then you're supposed to align with that particular emotion. Need for revenge or need to trả thù or dấn thân thay đổi Việt Nam or all that narrative. And being older, I can tell you that pressure was very heavy on my shoulders because my dad say, when you grow up, you need to dấn thân để giải cứu Việt miền Nam or something along that line. And I'm thinking, but I'm American and I'm not in the army. I'm not, taking an army back to this is like a fantasy, you know what I mean? To come back and liberate Vietnam like again, I guess. And I just thought, no, that's not who I am, you know? And so I understand where he's come from. I know the sadness and I write about his sadness and I acknowledge it, but I refuse to let that sadness own me. I process them through me and I say, yeah, that's where it ends because I will not carry your grief through me. You know, I will acknowledge it, I will honor it, but I will not let it rule my life, you know? And so, writing has been a great relief, because it allowed me a kind of framework to talk about those things. What does it mean to be my father's son who was a general in that war, who fought, many battles and so on, and carried that wound and that memory? All those things I worked through my writing. And I can tell you that once you work through that writing and it makes sense to you, is that you're not exactly through with that history, but you manage to own that history in a way that it doesn't own you. You know what I mean? You give meanings to it and you give a kind of catharsis to it, and that you say, okay, that's what it is. And now this is who I am, you know? So then there's a way in which where you are self-liberated, from that war if you work through all those emotions and all those acknowledgments.
And the crazy thing is, your life is processing being the son of a general. The way I had to have processed this is the aftermath of
Yeah.
having this Asian face in American society post-war,
Yeah.
10 years later, 15 years, dealing with the taunts, being in the military, US Marines, and dealing with the racism of being Vietnamese, the drill sergeants calling you names and dealing with the white superiority within the military ranks and
Yeah.
having this confusion and dealing with the identity of being a Vietnamese American. Wait, but we're on the right side of the war. Why am I getting made fun of when I was the son of people who were in the CIA and Phoenix programs, and we fought on the same side. Why am I getting made fun of? And I think that that burden is a different. Now it's becoming a different narrative, and you're right. I write too. I write to process, and I talk on podcasts to process these weird feelings. And I imagine all of the people that are of my generation, born here in America, who live in the Midwest or somewhere in the Northeast, completely removed the Vietnamese culture, and
Yeah.
they are now part of just white mainstream, and they're like, who cares about this stuff? Like, it doesn't affect me, but it does, because it's, I see cousins in South Carolina. When I'm with them, their white friends make fun of them, and they don't realize that they're being made fun of. I think I'm looking at it going, this is emotionally exhausting for me, but it does not. It's like nước đổ lên đầu con vịt. It just falls right off their head, and it's like there's no impact on their being. So it's just a weird place to constantly be thinking, and it's emotionally exhausting to be thinking about this stuff.
So in my brings back this memory of if you have a chance, read the story of this. I forgot. I think this hour is full of noises. It's about uh this student at Berkeley, who has this idea that he's going to be a doctor. He's in biochem. He's dating a white girl. Everything was perfect. He's getting A's in biochemistry. You know, cheated a little, but you know, and so life was good. And then this is why I'm fascinated with short story, because everything seems to be good until there is an eruption of something. And in his case, he was on the street and he saw a homeless man who said he's a Vietnam vet, and they had an argument. And the guy took out a cigarette case, and he say, "Watch out!" And then he takes out the case, he opens it, and there's an ear. And this kid is completely shocked, right? Because the guy say, I cut off this ear of a gook, so I'm not scared of you, that sort of thing, right? So later on, that ear came back in the story. But what I'm saying is that sometimes you think your life is good and that history has nothing to do with you,
Yeah.
and then it shows up in your face, right? And you don't know how to process it because you never process because you think you're good, right? Until you're not, and I find that really fascinating because sometimes history does erupt, and then how do you process those things? That's the juncture between past and present that I'm finding really fascinating in fiction.
And I found that I read stories from the Edge of the Sea, and the short stories in it are like miniature episodes that you confront everything. It's not just about the Vietnamese culture, but it's about lusting after somebody at the Goog, and at the Guggenheim. So that was my favorite one. Um, how did you? How long did it take for you to put all these short stories together? And I think some of them are purely fiction. They doesn't seem to really reflect sort of a autobiographical nature, but some of them are just like sort of like outside experiences of other people that you've written in the first person, or
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, fiction has to have some truth. In fact, the truest fiction makes people feel like, oh my God, this feels so real, right? Um, uh, some of the best compliments I have from my previous book, Words of Paradise Lost, was some graduate student in creative writing came up and say, I didn't want that short story to end. I want to take him to lunch. I said, he's fictional character. But um, I think the first rule of fiction is you write a well-rounded character. You have to create someone that is believable enough that you feel like, yeah, that person could be real in real life, right? And sometimes it is borrowed, sometimes it is fragments of myself, right? But it's not biographically correct, it's just borrowed from fragments, that's why it's called fiction. But as long as I'm going after some existential truth, that is dramatized by my characters, then I feel like I'm doing the work that I wanted to do. You
Yeah.
know, but
Right.
go ahead.
I suggest everybody picking up this if you need an introduction to Andrew Lam, because it shows such a vast array of a range of your writing, and it's just really snappy, and it's just witty, and and I really enjoyed it. And if you need an introduction to your writing, I mean, I think this is such a beautiful starting place, and you can just read one story a night.
Right.
It's very fast, and it was hard to put down the book. It's just fascinating. Where can people pick it up? Where can people buy it?
Well, it's on Amazon, but it's also Red Hen Books also sell it on their website. These days, it's hard to say which bookstore because I don't know if there are any bookstores left. But you can also ask your bookstore to order, and they will. Just ask Andrew Lamb's Stories from the Edge of the Sea. And they will.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I really love it. Now, well, I want to switch, and we can come back to it too throughout
Yeah.
this podcast. But I want to talk about like the juxtaposition between what we're seeing online in Vietnam right now today,
Mhm.
and what we're seeing or lack of seeing, we're not seeing in the Southern Cal. I don't know in NorCal what it's like, but in SoCal, there's no really big events that are like, you would think that there's big events for April 30, right?
But like we're not big anymore. They're kind of like town hall kind of situation. I
Mhm.
actually did uh, a thing 2 days ago at an auditorium in San Jose for like 300-400 people, and we had dignitaries come and mayors and congresswomen and so on. But basically commemorate that day. But I don't think that intensity is there compared to those first few years when I talk about wearing white
Yeah.
headbands and that I was sang back then. Because I think for one thing, the fervor or the hatred that's carried by previous generation is sort of fading. Uh, I'm sure there's still a lot of unfinished business, but for the most part, I think it's much calmer now dealing with that date than before. And in Vietnam, it's actually not as big as it would have been had the US not imposed the tariff on Vietnam, because now Vietnam is tiptoeing from celebrating that date for fear that it will upset the US government. Because in the past, they said that, we defeated American imperialism
Yeah.
and that sort of thing. And so now they're more careful with the language. I think they emphasize the liberation more than the "they with me" part. You know, because "they with me" is still taxing your ass.
There's still over 10,000 soldiers marching with like thousands of drones that are like painting pictures of Ho Chi Minh, and
Yeah,
all of
but
these
I
things.
think it's normal for a dictatorship to show military might. They all do it, and I think the U.S. is going to go that route too. But I think it's just to show that don't tread on us. And I think it's more like we are willing to fight to protect our nation. But it could easily be a message for China for all we know.
Right. Interesting.
You know what I mean? And I'm not sure you saw the New York Times article where the U.S. State Department tells all its diplomats not to attend any of those
Mhm.
events, right? So it's already in Vietnamese language is "yang mak,"
Right.
you
Right.
better be careful what you say because we're still taxing you. You know what I mean? So I don't think they're celebrating it the way they had wanted
Plan
to
to.
plan to, like a major propaganda move or something. But now it's much more like, oh, let's watch what America has to say, because we're still dealing with their working day.
I still don't know if I agree with you about the fervor here in SoCal of the previous generation dying out. I think it's a little bit more. I don't know what the word is, but I think it's a little bit more calculated. I think, and I don't know. My guess, and correct me if I'm wrong here. I might not. be, I'm just guessing.
Mm.
There's so many people doing business with Vietnam now.
Yeah.
There's so many people having, trips that are, a year, every year, once or twice. Some people own land, some people own homes, some people own
Yeah.
property.
People about to retire.
Yeah. There's so many people that are like connected to the homeland. And so
Yeah.
like, how can anybody go out in the streets and parade and down
Yeah.
Cộng sản, that spirit is sort of like, it's washed away, or I don't really
I
know.
don't disagree with that at all. I think, when I was doing my speech 2 days ago, uh, it was it was really sad in a way to see the old folks who used to wear those military uniforms.
Yeah.
Really old, right? And they're still wearing the uniform, but some are on wheelchairs,
Yeah.
and some are like barely able to walk and had to have help. I mean, they're still wearing the uniform, but they are much older, you know. And I think that energy goes out when you're reaching your 70s and 80s, and so it's not as if they don't want to. It's just that that energy is fading because old age, right? And there might be still younger generation who carry some resentment, but it's not a collective anger the way it used to be.
Yeah.
And clearly that's the case.
As you're saying that energy dissipates at 70 or 80, I'm like, it's dissipating for me right now, going into my 50s right now. And I'm often wondering, like, what do I talk about once, the 4:30 date has gone, and who am I? What becomes of me as I lose the energy to really talk, and hopefully I do lose the energy to
Yeah.
talk about this kind of identity and really focus on like the beauty of the modern Vietnamese, right? But it's still
Yeah.
here, and I'm hoping that. But then what happens? What's next for us?
Right. Um,
We can't keep dwelling on this stuff, can we?
yeah, so I'm gonna read a couple of paragraph on that date just because it's how how I process it. And this is from a few tweets. Sorry, I forgot what I wrote. Oh,
Open dreams.
yeah. So April 30th, 1975, defeat or liberation. It was a day of joyous victory, say a retired communist official in Hanoi. We fought and realized Uncle Ho's dream of national independence, that he asked for Marlboro cigarettes and a few precious dollars. Myung Nguyen, a real estate salesman in San Jose and former South Vietnamese naval officer, said, I could never forget the date. So many people died, so much blood. I could never tolerate communism. Mai Hương, a young, smartly dressed Vietnamese businesswoman in Saigon, had another opinion. Of course, it was National Liberation Day, she said, but it's the South, she whispered, that liberated the North. Indeed, conservative Uncle Ho has slowly admitted defeat to entrepreneurial and cosmopolitan Miss Saigon. She has taken her meaning from a different uncle, Uncle Sam. The customs man, on the other hand, stamped my passport and say, in truth, brother, there are no winners, no losers. You're lucky, brother, you left Vietnam and became an American. April 30th, 1995. In the Berkeley Hills, in a house that gave to the bay, my Vietnamese American friends and I watched Gone with the Wind for the umpteenth time and looked for the scene of our unrequited romantic longings. Scarlet, teary-eyed with wind-blown hair, returning to live in forlorn Tara. She's doing something we no longer can. Or rather, we go only to look and sometimes enter the houses where we once lived, but then we take leave. Children of defeat, self-liberating adults, we hugged instead, and over a couple of very dry Merlot, recounted to each other our own stories of flight.
Beautiful.
That's how it ends.
So for you, is it liberation or is it defeat?
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to say in the piece is that there is the historical loss, yeah, but there is a psychological transformation as well for me, which is self-liberating from mourning and being owned by that grief.
I wish most of us can start to adapt this adopt this sort of mentality, because I think it will allow us to exist in all places that are Vietnamese.
Yeah.
It will allow us to love and to forgive
Yeah.
and just to do the intake of the culture of how beautiful
Right.
Vietnam is today, despite all of the fighting and despite all the loss that we can now enjoy after 50 years. We should be able to enjoy each other.
Right.
The people in Vietnam, the people in Vietnamese American diaspora, we do have a deep connection to each other.
Right. I think there is transformative powers in a way of seeing, or a way of seeing differently. Because, one time I went to the Coochie Tunnel. Have you been there?
Yeah.
Where, it was originally very small, but then American veterans came back and they wanted to see, and they have to dig it like 3 times the size so that 5 Americans can go through it. you know, it's like super size me Coochie.
Super size me Gucci. Gucci, the American version.
Yeah. Coochie 2.0, let's say. And then, what's so fascinating about that trip was that I'm the only Vietnamese, and so then the tour guy was sort of asking me to help with the translation and stuff. And then she's like, "Oh my God, this is a while back, like 20 years ago or something." And then she's like, "Oh my God, Viet Kill, where do you live?" I say in California. And it's like, "Oh, I always wanted to go to Disneyland. It's my dream. My friends are inviting me. I'm saving money to come to Disneyland." And I thought, you know, the Vietnam vet who was standing 10 feet away, staring at that hole in the ground, weeping because his friends died for it. And then the Vietnamese lady who was born years after that war, who learns English and love Americans, couldn't wait to get to Disneyland. So she saw the tunnel as a way to make money so she can go to see Disneyland. You know what I mean? And for me, that is a transformative moment, right? War, peace, memory, and the future, all those things are in us. But I don't think, the war should own us in the way that, it used to.
Andrew, let me ask you something about the way you write and the way you think. The story that you just told shows up many times in Stories from the Edge of the Sea in terms of two polarizing ways of thinking.
Mhm.
But I, as I'm reading all these stories, I was thinking, do these stories happen at the same time that you tell it? Because you're putting them all together at the same time to kind of like compare and contrast views, or are they really happening in real time? I mean, it sounds like the Coochie Tunnel one in Disneyland, that's happening in real time, but how? Because a lot of these stories are it feels so natural and engineered so well. But I think yeah, there were several times I'm like, oh my God, Andrew has such a brilliant way of like putting these two, opposite ends together so we can uh cook them, right? So we can
Yeah.
be aware and wake up to the irony of Disneyland and the Coochie tunnels and veterans, and
Yeah.
how much of this is actually happening in real time and how much of it has to be engineered to fit narratives.
I'm not sure how my mind works exactly, but when she said Disneyland, I started giggling because it's like the irony, right? How many people get bombed out because of this thing, and here she is, introducing this wartime contraption, and all she can think of is going to LA and Disneyland. And I thought that's the story of Vietnam. I mean, that's how weird it is. Like, giải phóng hay là, mất nước, and why do we have to pick any of those things? We can just tell it and live with that complexity,
I hope that you and I can play a game one day. Name that taboo, and it doesn't become taboo anymore. Like when you talk about Ho Chi Minh as a hero, that's taboo. And I talked to somebody about that, and obviously he's not a hero to the South Vietnamese government families of ours, and but I talked to somebody about this, and Tony Bui, the filmmaker, and we
Yeah.
recently had a discussion, and he said, yeah, it's a very nuanced conversation because Ho Chi Minh had 11 aliases. Pick
Yeah.
one alias. Pick one period in his life. Ike Wook was one of the names, which is the love of country. And you could say that that love of country is very different from the Ho Chi Minh that you see all over the city of
Yeah.
Ho Chi Minh City now as a propaganda piece
Yeah.
of a villain of the South Vietnamese government and all of the horrific atrocities that we as the South, we see that as a symbol of hatred of somebody who's really created a lot of loss in our families. But at the same time, if we are to discuss these taboo, make a game out of these taboo subjects, they'll be gone in a few years or a few decades. These things aren't going to be so taboo anymore. And I wanted to get your thoughts on sort of like the things that have been taboo in our lifetime and, the things that you think that will not be taboo anymore in a few years.
Well, are you talking about things related to Vietnam or?
Yeah, Vietnam and Vietnamese diaspora.
Yeah, well, I mean, the most taboo thing would be the flag of South Vietnam, right?
Yeah.
It brings up such a primal feeling for so many people, right? And yet the question is, does it really represent anything at this point, right? And that's really tabooish to even ask, right? Like, did Jesus exist? you know, it
Was Mary a virgin?
was Mary a virgin. So I didn't know you get to vote on that. But anyway, people kill each other on that. So, but like, yeah. So it's like there are things that we are supposedly to take as sacred, right? But why is it sacred, right? I'm not sure you remember when we were at the Vala event at Bowers Museum, and someone in the audience, older but very eloquent in English, stood up and asked, "Why did you change your name?" You know, and to her, it was a big deal. I think and there is a tone of being judgmental in the voice. Is that you should appreciate and love your Vietnamese name, right? Uh, and she speaks from the point of view of like she's the holder of truth, you know. You know what I mean? But why does she think she does is the holder of truth? Because if you go back in history in the 1800s, when the Nguyen dynasty came up, a lot of Ho and Zheng, and they changed their name too because they're afraid of persecution. And then suddenly I have friends who tell me that their last name was not Nguyen before 5 generations ago.
Yeah.
They all switched. So why does she think her Nguyen family's name is so sacred if in fact so many have changed it out of practicality and survival, right? So then the question is, why do people think what they know is absolute truth and sacred, right? Because everything should be questioned, right? And worked through. And if they are good to you, if they make sense and are workable, then you keep them. And if they don't, yeah.
Where do we draw the line when we question? Because I think that's the hot water that I found myself in, which is it's okay to question. It's okay to talk about certain things that are hurtful, but I think it's the way we execute these questions that really hurt people.
I hear you. So what you should take is improvisation. Uh, improvisation teaches you yes and yes but, meaning that you don't immediately negate whatever they have to say. You say, yes, I hear you, and that's an interesting point, but have you thought of? Or yes, and then there's this other point of view. Did you know? Meaning that people in conversation are very offended and very quickly offended when you say no. Or I don't agree, right? So there is a way in which you create a space in which their point of view is represented and clearly heard, but then still challenged in a way that is not like an attack, at least not the way they perceive it to be. So I wasn't kidding about improv. Improv teaches you to pay attention to how people talk. And sometimes people, when they negate, like I don't like that, or I disagree with all that, then it's very much like a boxing match, right? And people are forced into a position of attack, whereas Ukraine is like yes and it's an interesting way of creating this you widen the pie, you
Yeah.
make it like this space where people say, well, my opinion is such that, what I mean. So think about it, but yeah, that's how it works for my conversation, you know.
Are you happy today with where things are? Do you want to see change? And if you do want to see change in the Vietnamese global community, what are some of the things that you would hope for?
Yeah. um I'm not, well, it's, am I happy today? I thought, well, that's a very general question, but I am dissatisfied with uh the development, or the rate of development of our community. I am in awe and in admiration of so many individuals who made incredible strides in, different walks of life, from art to science to, technology to business, and so on. But as a community, we haven't evolved a whole lot. You know, if you think about it, a community that's 50 years in America, that doesn't have a foundation to give awards to its best and brightest, uh, it's already a loss, right? Because it doesn't seem to acknowledge second, third generation and their achievements. Say Vietnamese American Foundation of Little Saigon, whatever. I'm just making that up, or a grant that will give a scholar power to study Vietnamese history in America, or a grant that give translation of Vietnamese writers who write in Vietnamese in the U.S., especially the first generation, like our parents' generation. My dad wrote in English, but a lot of his friends wrote their memoirs in Vietnamese. And where's that translation? Because I can tell you that when I give talks at universities, there's a lot of young generation who do scholarship, but they cannot read in Vietnamese. And then they have cross references to, like, generals and soldiers from the North who wrote stuff that got translated because there's funding for that. But like our own people, who's writing end up in little bookstores in Little Saigon that is, only accessible to other Vietnamese reading people, and their children are studying somebody else's work and not their parents. And I think that is something that a community where things have progressed should be able to do.
I think that that is something that we lack. And I think that having focus on that is a difficult thing. I think because the Vietnamese culture, or Asian culture for that matter, uh, they don't put a heavy emphasis in the arts the way sort of I think the West does right now.
Mhm.
I'm not saying that it's completely not there. I'm just saying that it's not as heavily emphasized. The cultural passing on of stories is not as viewed as, important as money and
Right.
statuses.
But I'll tell you what. I mean, yes, but if you look at, yes, but yeah, you look at um South Korea, you know, South Korea, and the rise of Korean arts and movies
Entertainment.
and entertainment is not by a fluke. It is intentional. The government itself perceives its cultural products as a soft diplomacy effort around the world. It even pays to build a, K-pop museum, right? So why is that important? Because if you perceive culture is important, right? You create something that say, this is our cultural products. They even pay for the translation of the, soap opera so that it seduce even more non
Right.
Korean to get into the themes of their stories. And it's not as if they make so much money from that. The government doesn't, but it gains so much political weight around the world, right? And if you look at the Jewish community in America, which I
Yeah.
am the most powerful ethnic group, they have foundations up the gazoo. So that if you're writing about Israel or Israel relationship with the rest of Middle East, you can go to a foundation, and most likely, if you're any good, will get a big grant to travel and do the research, right? Why is that important? Because it gives a larger framework of who we are, you know. And I get disappointed every time they celebrate. Oh, we name another street in, Little Saigon. We got another flag up. Well, whoop it, you that. I mean, that's and then another statue. It's very much like geographically bound pride. It doesn't have a larger context of we live in a larger world and we want to make a statement. You know what I mean?
Andrew, thank you so much for today. We will be catching up hopefully in the next year to find out how much progress we've made after this huge day. April 30, 1975, the 50-year commemoration. And hopefully there's progress. There's got to be progress. I mean, as a community, we're doing a lot, but I think there's still a lot of work to do.
Yeah. Sure. Let's catch up.
Thank you for listening to The Vietnamese with Kenneth Nguyen. Special thanks to Brittany Tran, to Jane Nguyen, Catherine Nguyen, Tina Pham, Sydney Jamie, and Christo Trin. Please find us on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok at The Vietnamese Podcast.